I'm very happy that today I am able to warmly welcome you to our lunch webinar on human trafficking for the exploitation of forced marriage. My name is Eefje de Volder. Until a month ago, I was still a board member of Strada International, that you all know, the European NGO platform of dedicated grassroots organizations, actually with 33 members in 24 European countries. And I'm also co-director of Impact Center Against Human Trafficking and Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and advisor against human trafficking at CoMensha, the Dutch Coordination Center Against Human Trafficking. And today we are together actually to present our research that we in the past period have developed. We will present the outcomes, of course, on the exploitation of forced marriage, which Impact, together with Strada, took up with Sofia Bago, who will actually present the research in a minute as the main researcher, who actually has been working on this for the past year. Well, little bit of context, as you know, and particularly for those who were also present yesterday, the webinar is part of a webinar series. So yesterday, Strada International organized already the webinar on the exploitation of surrogacy. Today, we organized the second on the exploitation of forced marriage. And later, the third one will be held on the exploitation of illegal adoption. And as you know, this actually is the result of the fact that these three forms of exploitation have been added to the definition of human trafficking in the revised EU Anti-Trafficking Directive, which all EU member states hopefully are very working hard at this moment to implement, because it needs to be implemented as of the 15th of July of 2026. Well, as you know, the exploitation of surrogacy, forced marriage, and illegal adoption are considered human trafficking if the conduct fulfills all the elements of the definition of trafficking in human beings. So, as such, the revision does not imply at all that illegal adoption, surrogacy, or forced marriage practices should be automatically considered human trafficking. But yeah. The most important thing is that member states actually should ensure that measures to prevent human trafficking will not restrict or infringe in any way on the existing rights for persons to marry, adopt a child, or form a family. So we know it's not a practice in itself. It needs to be, it needs to fit the elements of the definition of trafficking. But apart from these more generic instructions, there is not much guidance given how this should be interpreted. And this has actually raised a lot of questions at the national level about the legal definition, the application in practice, especially when exploitative practices amount to human trafficking. And for the exploitation of forced marriage, the need for more clarity is even more relevant, because another EU directive on violence against women and domestic violence was adopted around the same time and requires member states to criminalize forced marriage separately. So actually, this marked the starting point of our research into the current national practices across Europe in actually 38 European countries, what Sophia will explain later. And the whole idea is to learn from that in order to ensure a harmonized response to dealing with the exploitation of forced marriage across EU member states. And as we will see, that might be a bit more challenging in reality than because of the divergent practices. So this actually resulted in the publication, a comparative analysis on the legal and policy landscape of trafficking for the exploitation of forced marriage across Europe. The publication itself will be available on the website on the 27th of October and will also be shared with the participants of the webinar today, so you will receive it in your emails. Well, what will we be doing during this 1.5 hours? Sophia will present the research findings, and followed we will have a panel discussion, actually bringing the discussion a bit further about the key issues, such as the indicators of exploitation, the legal and practical challenges of criminalizing the exploitation of forced marriage, and the broader impact of criminalization at all. So the panelists will actually be able to provide their insights from the national level. So as our research actually covers both EU and non-EU countries, as Sophia will tell a bit later, we actually reflected this diversity also in the panel. So we are joined by Ms. Anina Jokinen, who is actually a senior program officer at HEUNI, and who has conducted extensive research for a long time on forced marriage in Finland and also in many other countries. Also on the panel is Ms. Mariam Alemi, who is head of the legal team at Caritas Vienna. And she has actually led a project which was resulted in an in-depth study on forced marriage in Austria. And if I'm not mistaken, the links to these national researches will also be shared so that you can also have a look at it, because we use it also for our research, and it's very interesting to read. And finally, on the panel is Ms. Maria Todorowska, who is the program director at Open Gate, La Strada, North Macedonia. And they recently completed national research on forced marriage, also in the context of a project, also together with La Strada International, and recently launched a campaign against forced marriage in cooperation with La Strada International. And you might have already seen some of it, but she will also share more insights into that. Because what we will learn from today is that the criminalization is only one part of it, but if we do not raise awareness, if we don't collect data, etc., then we cannot effectively combat it. So feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat, or raise your hand if you have a question, so that we are able to give you the floor during the Q&A. We want it to be as interactive as possible, so don't shy away. If you don't want to show your face, you can just put it in the chat, no worries. And Susanne of La Strada International and Bruno Franken, they will help assist in all these technical issues. Yeah, so I think that sums up everything that we're going to do today. So then, without further ado, I want to give Sophia the floor to present the research.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Eefje, for introducing me. My name is Sophia, and yes, soon here will be my presentation scene as well. I'm very grateful to be here today, and because we've been working for the past year together with Impact and La Strada on this research. I'm very grateful to be able to present it to you. The research is about forced marriage, especially the forced marriage in the context of human trafficking across Europe. So let's just start. Yes, so the aim of the research was first to examine what is the current legal framework around forced marriage in Europe, how they deal with forced marriage currently, and then examine the impact of the three key legal instruments on this, and how they affected the obligations on countries. First, it was the Istanbul Convention, which first made it for countries to address forced marriage in some way. And then the two most recent directives, EU directives, the Violence Against Women Directive and the revised Anti-Trafficking Directive, which made it obligatory for countries for EU member states to include forced marriage as a separate criminal offense and as in context of human trafficking as well. The research that we conducted was mainly based on desk research. Thank you. During the desk research, we did a comparative analysis of the national legislation, as I have already said, to analyze how the countries currently deal with forced marriage. In this case, we did 38 European countries, out of which 27 EU member states and 11 other countries, whose selection was based on the presence of La Strada members whose valuable expertise helped us a lot to do an in-depth research about these countries, and also based on their status as EU candidate countries for accession and being Council of Europe member state. You can see the other 11 countries that we researched. And we also did interviews with national experts and conducted case studies in order to assess how they implement this legislation in practice. You can see on this slide the research questions that we tried to answer. The first and foremost question was that what is the current European legal framework when it comes to criminalizing forced marriage? Now, based on the newly adopted directives that pose further obligations on states. How is forced marriage dealt with at the national level? And based on that, we tried to see what are the best practices currently that cases implemented in order to fight forced marriages and how they are in line with this European legislative framework that we mentioned. And in this, we especially looked at the exploitation in the context of forced marriage, how exploitation can be seen, and how to distinguish between forced marriage and the exploitation of forced marriage for human trafficking, and how are these legal provisions implemented in practice. So I put here the definitions that we used for the research so that I know that we're on the same page. They are basically the currently internationally accepted definitions of forced marriage, child marriage, and early marriage. We used the definition for forced marriage, which states that it is a marriage in which one or both parties have not personally expressed their full and free consent. Child marriage is any union where at least one of the parties is under 18 years. And early marriage is are marriages where at least one person is below 18 years in those countries where the majority age is legally attained earlier than 18 years or upon marriage. So, as I have already stated, the base of the research was a country-specific analysis, and we used a uniform structure for these analysis. First, at every country, we looked at how they generally view marriage, what are the attitudes towards marriage, and then we looked at the civil law framework, of course, the criminal law framework, which was the heart of the research, and also the policy measures, the non-legislative measures, which are basically additional of how countries can fight and to give a response to forced marriages, and conducted case studies to see their practical implementation. So first, about the attitudes towards marriage. We saw that basically across whole Europe and all the 38 countries, there was a noticeable shift, which means that there was a decrease in the number of marriages and at the same time an increase in the number of alternative forms of relationships and also an increase in divorce rates. However, these alternative forms of relationships, for example, partnerships, marriage-like partnerships, civil, any type of relationships, are currently only criminalized in 13 countries out of the 38. For example, in Sweden and Luxembourg, Sweden also criminalizes under the definition of forced marriage, marriage-like relationships, and Luxembourg very broadly criminalizes partnerships under the definitions. It is really important because as there was an increase in the number of these alternative forms, it also means that these types of relationships are really similar to marriage. They are increasingly common, but they do not fall under the definition of forced marriage, given that they are not marriages. So it is really important for countries to also include anything similar like Sweden or Luxembourg. In civil law, the first shield against child marriages is the legal minimum age for marriage that the countries set. As you can see, still the majority of countries allow marriage to be, well, first they set the legal minimum age for marriage, but allow exceptions, sometimes even as early as 15 in the case of Lithuania. And 17 countries have already set their legal minimum age for marriage strictly at 18, with no exceptions allowed. And there's actually one country, which is Scotland, that still has its legal minimum age for marriage at 16 years. But Scotland has already made steps to align its marriage laws with the other parts of the UK. So there has been a really good trend towards setting the legal minimum age for marriage at 18, because Austria was actually also one of the countries that not so long ago changed their legal minimum age for marriage to 18 without any exceptions. Yes. In civil law, we also looked at the annulment of forced marriages, how their annulment, how if they even can annul a marriage, or a forced marriage can only be like the victims of forced marriage can only escape through divorce. In this sense, we checked who the applicant can be to request an annulment, and if there is, and what is the limitation period for this request to be brought. The most frequent practice for applicants is that the spouse concerned who can ask for the annulment. But there are some other practices as well, for example, in Belgium and France, where the state prosecutor may also initiate the proceedings in order to annul a marriage. This is really important because I will talk a bit more about it a bit later, that case studies shows that, of course, victims are in a very vulnerable state and they are not always able to request an annulment based on many different problems. They are either too scared, or they do not have the financial ways, or they're too dependent on their spouse and they just not able to actually do it. Which is also leads us to the other problem, which is the limitation period, which is problematic based on the same things. And for the limitation period, it means that after a while, after a few months or years have passed, the person is not able to request an annulment, which means that the marriage that was initially forced will be considered consensual. The most frequent practice for that is this limitation period starts when the coercion has ceased. And the most frequent period is either 6 months or 1 year to be brought from the moment the coercion has ceased. This could be problematic because of the same things that I have already mentioned, that victims are in a very vulnerable state. They are completely dependent on their spouse. And even though the coercion has ceased, they are still maybe lack support. They lack language skills. They lack legal skills, and it's just not enough time for them to actually request an annulment. In this case, an ideal practice would be Switzerland, which does not have any limitation period. The application can be brought at any point of time. But also good practice, Albania and Luxembourg, where the limitation period only begins when the spouse actually regains their full freedom, and not from the time when the coercion has ceased, which is already very different. And in Germany, this limitation period is 3 years, that even though there is a limitation period, this time is quite extensive, and the person may be more able to actually initiate an annulment. And the grounds for an annulment are usually if the marriage was, the conclusion of the marriage was the result of physical violence or serious criminal threat, which does not cover many situations a person can be forced into marriage. For example, psychological pressure or other forms of psychological elements that can cause this. in criminal law, we looked at how countries currently criminalize forced marriage, whether they have an explicit standalone offense for forced marriage, whether they implicitly cover it under general criminal provisions such as duress or coercion, or they criminalize it under trafficking in human beings, either explicitly or implicitly. Or they can also criminalize it under trafficking in human beings and as a standalone offense. There are also 4 countries that already do that. Currently, we can see that sorry. Can you go back a bit? Sorry. Thank you. So we can see that most of the countries has already explicitly criminalized it as a standalone offense, and not too many countries currently criminalize it under trafficking in human beings. And in some countries, even though it is not explicitly criminalized, but can be implicitly prosecuted under general provisions. But I will get back to this in shortly. But yeah, so please go to the next slide. Thank you. And after the criminal provisions, we looked at the case studies and the policy measures. The case studies shows the vulnerability of the victims, which I think everyone is familiar with, and I have already mentioned that it is really relevant for the annulment and for the prosecution. It is for the annulment for the things that I have already said, and for the prosecution, in many cases, the forced marriage victims actually do not want to go further and to prosecute the case, because either it includes a family member and they do not want them to be criminally prosecuted, or they fear, and it can be many other things that it stops them from actually wanting the case to be prosecuted. Also, the question of tradition was really relevant because the current practice is very divergent. For example, in Bulgaria, we've seen cases where it included bride kidnapping in several communities. For example, in the Roma community, there were cases where the bride was kidnapped and they said that it was tradition, and they do not and they try to hide it under the umbrella of being a tradition. But Bulgarian judges did not consider it tradition and actually prosecuted the cases. While also there were other from Bulgaria and Italy, where there was a payment of dowry also in a Roma community, which these cases were considered tradition and did not prosecute it. And that's why these cases actually ended up at the European Court of Human Rights, because the victims did not consider it to be tradition, of course, and they wanted their case to be prosecuted. But in Italy and Bulgaria, they did not, as they had it under the umbrella of being a tradition. We also looked at the Grevio reports to see how these provisions were implemented in practice and what policy measures they used to further address the forced marriages. However, what we see is that most countries currently lack mostly policy measures. For example, awareness-raising campaigns and the training of frontline workers and the education about forced marriage is very lacking. And it shows in a case study from Spain that actually there was a victim of forced marriage and went to the authorities to seek help and to have her case prosecuted, but the authorities simply did not believe her that it happened to her, and it was in the end not prosecuted, and it really shows the lack of education for frontline workers. So, and about forced marriage through the lens of trafficking in human beings. Their connection is that forced marriage can be prosecuted under trafficking either explicitly or implicitly. It can be prosecuted explicitly when forced marriage is listed explicitly as a form of exploitation. And it can also be implicitly criminalized when the provision for trafficking in human beings includes and other forms of exploitation part as other forms of exploitation, which leaves an open-ended list and possibly include forced marriage. And forced marriage in the context of trafficking can be seen as either a means or a purpose of exploitation. It can be seen as a means when forced marriage is used to create a state of dependency based on which further exploitation, either, for example, sexual or labor exploitation, can be done. And it can be a purpose of the exploitation. However, the intent to exploit and how countries consider exploitation manifests in several ways. It's really not uniform yet. For example, in Spain, we've seen cases where forced marriage was considered exploitation in and of itself without further exploitation, without having to prove any further exploitation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was a case when, of course, the marriage on one hand was forced, so it did not, the spouse did not consent to the marriage, and there was a payment of dowry, which is an additional element of exploitation, and it was paid to the parents and was considered exploitation. And it can be that forced marriage is present with any other form of exploitation, and in that case can be prosecuted under trafficking if there is further exploitation, for example, sexual or labor exploitation present in the marriage. And we also looked at whether it would be better to criminalize forced marriage under the trafficking in human beings provision or as a separate criminal offense, or maybe under both. First, there is, of course, the burden of proof. I think everyone's familiar with the burden of proof for trafficking is that we have to prove the act, means, and the purpose of exploitation, or in case of minors, the act and the purpose, which is in many cases really, really hard to prove and may and authorities may not even be able to prove it. However, forced marriage have less elements and it's easier to prove. But at the same time, the penalties are also higher for trafficking in human beings, which illustrates that, for example, in forced marriage, the highest penalty was in England and Wales, where it was 7 years of imprisonment, while the highest penalty for trafficking was in Cyprus, which was 25 years, or if it included a minor, then it was life imprisonment. Okay, so I see that Susan indicated that yes. Then I will also talk about it a bit later. But the potential overlaps that can occur if forced marriage and trafficking are criminalized, are both criminalized, which can have its pros and cons, but I will talk about that later as well. And there can be seen some good practices how countries can solve the issue of overlap. And we included the recommendations here that we also put in the research. Of course, to strengthen the legislation and criminalize forced marriage, both as a standalone offense and as a form of exploitation, to ensure that cases are actually investigated and prosecuted under anti-trafficking legislation, if it is possible, to to ensure greater clarity on how exploitation is defined and applied, because as we see, it is very, very divergent right now. To ensure the victim's access to protection, set the minimum legal age for marriage at strictly 18 without exceptions. To allow for the annulment of forced marriages without, if it is possible, any limitations. To also include non-legislative measures and to ensure systematic data collection. So thank you, that would be all. And if there will be any questions, then I will also answer them. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia, for sharing the insights. Of course, everyone can read them later on when having the report. I think there's one question that you can ask like this, and one you can just put in the chat, because there was a question about the Spanish case, in which year it was, so you can answer that in the chat. But there was also a question that was asked by Susanna Janssen about the religious marriage. So you were talking about the fact that there are forced marriage, and you have this in some countries you have a broader understanding of what a marriage is, including partnerships. Can you say anything about whether or not these definitions also included religious marriages?
Yes, so we also looked at whether a country allows religious marriage to be legally also considers it as legal marriage. And if a country considers religious marriages to be legal, then of course they are automatically fall under the category of forced marriage, because they are as legal as civil, as have the legal validity the same as civil marriages. And there are some countries that explicitly included religious and any other forms of marriages under their forced marriage legislation. So if they do not consider religious marriage to have the same legal validity, sometimes they include it under the forced marriage definition explicitly. But of course, there are also some countries that do not consider it legally valid and do not include it under the forced marriage definition. We also wrote about this in the research, so it can be so yeah, you can look at it a bit more in detail as well.
Well, thank you very much. We will now also move to the panelists, because it's also nice you already shared with during your presentation that it's quite a diverse landscape, actually, and that you see that even, for example, with the interpretation of exploitation, it can be very diverse how at the national level it is dealt with. And this, of course, hampers, in a way, a bit of a harmonized response. So therefore, I would like to move to the panelists, to Maria Alemi, to Anina Jokinen, and also Maria Todorowska, to actually share a bit of their initial reflections on the conclusions that we had. Irene, you have a next question. I will pose it for a moment and then come to it, because otherwise we are just confusing it. So hold the question, and then I will ask Sophia, or maybe she can ask or answer already in the chat. So yeah, it's just I will begin actually by addressing the two panelists who are based within the EU, because both Austria and Finland, they are under the same legislative obligation. So maybe first give the floor to Anina. To what extent do you see that the findings of the research that we had, the outcomes, to what extent does it reflect the situation in your country? Is it similar, or are there any very specific to the situation in Finland?
Yeah, thanks, Eefje. We just finalized an EU-funded project where we try to enhance assistance to victims of forced marriage and looked into, cooperated with countries such as Finland, Spain, Germany, and Ireland. And just from that experience, I think the study well reflects that even though we are under the same EU legislative frameworks, the countries themselves have very different legislation in place, in a way, in terms of like conceptual, how you define things, whether you have like a separate criminalization of forced marriage or not, and also like the systems in place are different. So in my country, Finland, we just amended our trafficking legislation on the beginning of this year to have forced marriage as an explicit purpose of exploitation. So it was previously covered by conditions contrary to human dignity, but we have now it explicitly there, and we don't have a separate criminalization of forced marriage. So if the case is a forced marriage, it's a case of trafficking. But if you cannot identify the elements of the trafficking, then it's also possible to use coercion.
So do you then mean that in your case, any case of forced marriage can only be will be considered as a trafficking case?
Well, to a degree, yes. So it also only in cases where it wouldn't be possible to identify the other elements, but the purpose of exploitation is already there, and then it depends on also the perspective, whether it's easy or to identify, the other two elements, the means and the act. But I just want to say that from the point of view of the victims' rights, this is a very good option because as victims of trafficking, victims of forced marriage then have access to specialized services, and our assistance is not tied to the criminal justice process, because of course then we all know that there are a lot of difficulties for the criminal justice system to find evidence of these elements, even though the experience of the person can be classified as trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage. But I think this is an area where having awareness is extremely important, because we've had quite a lot of discussion about forced marriage in Finland in the past few years, and it's actually now the second most commonly identified form of trafficking in Finland, according to statistics from our national assistance system for victims of trafficking. So there were like 66 victims that were accepted into the system last year out of a total of 207 victims. So it's quite a big proportion. But of course, this doesn't mean that there's a criminal justice process initiated in all of them, or not even in most of them, because there are all these kind of issues with what you can do in the criminal justice system side of things. But still, I think it's good for the system is good for the benefit of the victims, and ensuring that they have access to, like, for example, reflection periods and a residence permit options for victims of trafficking, as well as like free legal aid.
Yeah, so actually the purpose of including it in the EU directive explicitly to actually draw attention to the practice and getting it more recognized and seen and maybe prosecuted under the trafficking provision actually worked out in Finland.
Yeah, though I have to say that we did this before, like the process was like ongoing several years before the change in the directive.
No, but at least you
Yes,
see that it actually it's the example of that it actually will have that, or that it most probably will have that result also in other countries, that because the attention is more, that there will also be more victims, etc.
yeah. And
I think
one thing I can say,
yeah,
just want to say, and maybe we can
yeah,
touch upon this later, is that I think it's quite easy to, besides the forced marriage, to identify a lot of, exploitation, violence, and this kind of psychological control aspects. So that it's not just no, a situation where a person is like forced to marry and then they're perfectly fine. So it is actually, if you really put effort into it, quite easy to see all kinds of like very serious forms of violence and exploitation that are connected to this.
yeah. Okay, thank you. I think in a way, yeah, you might have already answered the question from Irina Vega Medina, because she actually asked whether there are no directives at the EU level that can be applied, considering that each country has its own legislation. Is there any way to bring the legislation together? Well, in a way, the EU directives and the changes try to at least bring some harmonization as to the criminalization of these acts. But the problem is, what you also mentioned, is that the difference is really also in how it is understood conceptually. So what do you mean when it comes to forced marriage or the exploitation of forced marriage, and how fast do you arrive at that stage? And this is where actually also a lot of the divergence comes in. So maybe now give the floor to Mariam. And you will probably also be able to ask the other question, because you are also an, can I say, like an asylum lawyer, right? So you are supporting a lot of victims. So I think that question will
Okay.
be for you. But maybe you can also reflect on what you have seen based on, your experience and research also in Austria.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Yes, in just to sort of set the scene slightly, the research that we carried out here in Austria was very comprehensive research regarding forced marriage, where we also looked at it from a multidisciplinary point of view, where we looked at the criminal law, the civil law, migration law, as you already mentioned, and where we also had a try to identify, I think would be a better way of saying it, what possible indicators are for forced marriage. To sort of answer your question, where is Austria? I would say we're somewhere in the middle, because Austria has implemented the Istanbul Convention, and we do have a criminalization of forced marriage. Okay. We also obviously have criminalization of trafficking, but forced marriage is not mentioned yet in the trafficking provisions. I think that will happen, but probably just before the deadline for implementation is there of the directive. And only now are we starting to have discussions about in what direction that could go. In terms of the criminal law, what we have seen here in Austria is one of the ideas, let me put it this way, of it being criminalized, of course, is also not just as a message that this is illegal, but also to collect statistics. We have very few statistics, even though it has been criminalized, because very, very few victims actually want to report their own families. And this remains really a key aspect here in Austria, at least, where it is very difficult to prosecute. So over 5 years, between 2019 and 2024, 61 complaints were made, but there were only 8 convictions. That really is not very high. And we assume that obviously sort of the figures will be much, much larger, so that the reporting is not really necessarily covering that. Religious and ritual marriages are not covered by the criminal law here in Austria. which is problematic because what we have seen is that in the majority of the cases that we know about, we were talking about religious marriages. So in Austria, I think I should say there is a special victim protection support for victims of forced marriage. It is separate to the victim protection organisation for trafficking. So there is an organisation there. And in most of the cases, if not all of the cases, where the victims were with the victim protection organisation, we are talking about religious marriages. So these are not being seen at all and not being dealt with, but the effects are still the same. Before we get into the pros and cons, the biggest problem remains identifying victims. And how we prosecute them is almost a little bit of a luxury problem. We're still really at the basic level, I think, of identifying and being in a situation where victims feel that they can come forward and actually say what is happening to them, and that at an early stage. That would be my summary of the situation in Austria.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think this is also quite reflected in the other countries, that the identification is difficult, and then the second phase is actually okay, but if you are identified, the chances of you wanting to participate in criminal proceedings will be actually quite low because of the fact that you have family members being involved. So this is also something that we saw, and also explains probably the limited number of case studies that we also found and have included. So there was a question from Marina Gomez Hernandez, and she actually asked, do you think there might be implications arising from the potential overlap between international protection asylum schemes and the new directive on the protection of survivors of forced marriage if the marriage took place in third countries? And which do you think would be the most protective scheme for third country nationals? And maybe, based on your expertise, I think you are the right person to ask.
Yes, thank you very much. I see a huge number of women who have been victims of forced marriage in the past from third countries and who are seeking protection, possibly with different reasons and not necessarily because of the forced marriage. To be honest, they work fine parallel up until now. You know, we have the criminalization of forced marriage here as well. We have the directives regarding trafficking. We have the Istanbul Convention also regarding forced marriage. There is no problem with all of these systems working in parallel with one another. That means we can still advise the women whether or not they would like to make a criminal case and seek help regarding sort of the consequences of the forced marriage and psychological help, etc. That doesn't preclude or stop any access to asylum or international protection at all. So I see no problems, not even on a practical level. The systems work parallel and they can work well together.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I saw also a question of Heather, who actually asked whether the research included recommendations for legal rights and protections for victims and their children that come from forced marriage. Well, I can already answer that this is unfortunately not something that we looked into, because we really looked at understanding the how to distinguish between these forms, and we didn't touch upon what that actually meant, that the moment that we know that the moment that it's seen as the indications of forced marriage, that you would be able to make use of the already existing protective mechanisms under that scheme. But we didn't look into whether that would be different at the national level also for forced marriage in itself. As Mariam also was mentioning, is the case in Austria, that there is this protective scheme already in place for victims of forced marriage as a whole. And I know that for the Netherlands as well. So we didn't touch upon it. Maybe, I don't know whether someone in the national research did look into that. And otherwise, this would be a good thing maybe to follow up also on.
We looked at it briefly, Eefje, if I in terms of protection for victims. One thing that will be also very important, this happens more in a migration context, is also non-punishment would also be very important. Often, I don't know if you've got an illegal status as a result of the forced marriage. We see that a lot, that women are brought to Austria, forced to marry here, but nobody makes sure that they have a right to stay here. That's obviously also a breach of Austrian law. And there it would be important that they're not punished for that. So we had a look at issues of non-punishment, and also that you have free access to lawyers in any criminal proceedings, obviously also as a victim of forced marriage, and psychosocial care provided by the government. These are all things that actually exist in Austria, but as ever, the funding is sometimes a little bit difficult. So those were definitely recommendations that we had.
Yeah. And another question that was asked by Susanna Janssen was whether, in cases of violence against women, it should be looked at whether the marriage is forced marriage. And I think, yeah, this really touches upon also maybe in connection with what Anina was saying, like the moment that you start to flag forced marriage and the exploitation of forced marriage more as an issue, then most probably things that you would normally categorize as a domestic violence or intimate control or all kinds of violent acts within the private sphere. You will look at it differently, and I can tell from our experience in the Netherlands that we do see that now we start to talk with a lot of actors also more looking at domestic violence, but forced marriage also separately, that it will lead to a different analysis of the cases that they would formally label differently. So I think that's really, that's really the case. Oh, Heather was indicating that the question really specifically in regards to parental rights and protections.
Yeah, I can expand. If there is a child, so anyone under the age of 18, in Austria at least, then child services are automatically informed. That means, there will be social workers that are working with the family and working with the child to find solutions. I don't know of any case where, as a result of forced marriage, the guardianship was taken from the parents, in case you're wondering, but protections will be put in place. There have been cases where the children are then taken into the care of the child services. Sometimes they stay with the forced traffic organisation. It depends on what the child wants and how old they are, obviously.
Maria, is this something that you actually saw at within the research or the things that you're doing in North Macedonia, that there are specific also recommendations in relation to rights and protections that you made in that context?
Well, actually, yes, most of it's connected mainly about that, because in our situation in North Macedonia is that a forced marriage is actually defined as a human trafficking and child trafficking in our law, but in reality is not applied as it should be, and it's not enforced as it should be, relying on the statements only of these mostly girls and women, which at the end it end up without any kind of protection or assistance, long-term support and reintegration that we particularly recommend for these cases. But in general, because it was discussed about children, forced marriages, so this is particular profile, I would say, for North Macedonia, because majority of cases is actually child trafficking because of child marriage, which is a different complexity from arranged marriage to a severe form of having all the elements of the trafficking that reflects on how it is actually applied in the practice. So basically, I have prepared some kind of a short maybe presentation for you to see it, although you can also see it in our analysis. What I can mention particularly is that we are the country that actually have no standalone offense on forced marriages. That also is one of the problem, because those cases lead to bit more less charges, are qualified less than trafficking, are qualified like neglection of a child or for domestic violence, which end up actually without any kind of conviction or protection. Moreover, we are the one country that allows marriage to be enacted even at 16 with the court approval. That is also some kind of a loophole that actually facilitate early and forced marriages in our cases. So this is one of our recommendation, I would say, for the what should be changed and should be strengthened in terms of the legal framework. Next to that, what is the reality in our country is that child and forced marriages is seen as a tradition still, and this is the main gap why most of the cases are not processed as violence, as trafficking, and this is one of our main, let's say, problem that we need to work on mainly through capacity building, to prevention campaigns, raise awareness, and so on. That is quite very much important. But it's also, I would say, particularly, let's say, important to mention in terms of indication of exploitation. The analysis confirms that actually the forced marriages in North Macedonia function as a mechanism of control and exploitation in the same time. In all documented cases, girls, mostly aged 14 to 16 from Roma and rural community, were actually forced into unregistered marriages arranged by their family, often to repay debt, reduce economic burden, or fulfill some patriarchal expectation, all circumstances that directly relates with the action, means, and purposes stated in the definition of trafficking human being, which we use also when it comes to advocacy for more identification of these cases. Particular, I will mention that there is a moment of cross-border moment of cooperation in our case. For example, in many of the cases, the girls are recruited and transferred, sometimes across state borders under false promises from marriage, which ends up into a situation of exploitation. That's why in our analysis, which is mainly based on the cases, practical cases that we have we had in our work, as well as the cases of our colleagues from Serbia and Albania, which is the mostly cross-border casing of issues, show the needs for strengthening this cooperation, but also to see this element. In terms of the means, are definitely used coercion, deception, abuse, vulnerability in terms of the profile of what is there, which I've mentioned, the girls, the Roma, the discrimination, which is also quite very relevant. But there is also evident in terms of means the concrete financial transaction, which are sometimes translated as buying of a bride, of exchanging of dowry, which is quite often in the cases of forced marriages. And last but not least, also the purpose in most of the situation, the purpose is sexual, but also labor exploitation, the domestic servitude, which is sometimes combined both when it comes to the cases that we have dealt on. Recently, there is also a quite increase in terms of using the digital recruitment when it comes especially for our children in our cases, and also forced marriages as a mean of economic control, which are also present in North Macedonia and Albania for several years, that it is actually documented, I would say, in our analysis. It's pity that you can't see my presentation. I also wanted to just strike the point.
I can show it. We can show it in a moment. Is that fine? You want to go through it? Yeah.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's okay. I can share it with you later on, but this is just for the. I just wanted to present two of the cases out of the three that are in the analysis that actually highlights how the system fails to identify trafficking behind the forced marriages. But since there is no qualification also as an independent, let's say, sole act, then this is the situation. The first case that you would see in our analysis is about a Roma girl that was forced into 3 marriages, and one was with the aim to repay a family debt. And despite this clear coercion, authority dismissed the case as a custom, although she became a mother at 50.
Your PowerPoint is now coming up, so then we just do it now.
Oh, it's back. So
Yeah.
these are the cases. So actually, the first case that actually, despite the clear coercion, authority dismissed the case as a custom. And what is also striking that she became a mother when she was 15, which also reflect on how inactive are the institution when it comes to protection in forced marriages and adolescent pregnancies that sometimes can reflect on the cases of forced marriages. This case show how economic coercion makes masked as tradition keeps exploitation in a way invisible. And the second case, which is real, explains the acts, the means, and the purposes from a different aspect, but unfortunately it was not processed as trafficking human beings, mainly because of the lack of capacity of the institution to do proper investigation, collect evidence, and build cases that at the end would provide proper punishment for the perpetrators and give a good, let's say, example. And on the other hand, unfortunately, it ends up with impunity, especially for cases that it's also about child trafficking, child marriage that should not be left like that. Maybe this is just for you to see it, although we have one positive case in the analysis, you can see it, which is basically how it should be, where even before any kind of exploitation or an action of the marriage of a child, the case was revealed in the attempt to be transferred in a foreign country, which also show how important it is to have to build the cross-border cooperation and capacity of the law enforcement authority to proactively work on these cases and identify it before any kind of exploitation is done. And next slide is about the recommendation. But it was already absolved. All of these recommendations that were also reflected in the recommendation of the analysis of Strada International. But I will maybe keep on the, let's say, on the recommendation that we really need a more continuing awareness and educational effort on this aspect. And that is the main reason why we actually part of this project. We have, together with Strada International, we have also conducted campaign for awareness raising, which actually which have been launched it was launched on the World Days Against Trafficking, 30th of July, under the name I do not consent to forced marriages, reflect to the autonomy of and the consent of the women, which is the key point when it comes to trafficking, but also to forced marriages when you see it as a through gender lenses. So it's a campaign that went through the social media. There was live video promoting the survivors' voices, but there was also a lot of community events, empowerment activity directly with the vulnerable community, mainly Roma, that unfortunately are still highly vulnerable when it comes to trafficking in general, including for the forced marriages. The campaign is focused on amplifying their voices, but also call on action of what we are discussing right now, that it's quite important, and that is to jointly, all together, react and respond to these cases, all together, institutions, civil society, but also community when it comes to the cases of forced marriages. But nevertheless, the biggest aim of this campaign is actually to advocate for for legal changes, but also active implementation of the legal implication in order to have a more proactive surveillance or identification of cases and proper protection and assistance for the women and girls that unfortunately have suffered forced marriage and trafficking in human being. The results have been highly encouraging, I would say, showing strong public interest and growing awareness of forced marriages as a serious form of exploitation. I would say on a national level. That you can check all the campaign and all the messages on our social media platforms, where you could also join and share some of the messages, which are both on English and on Macedonia. And last but not least, just to mention that actually we have been doing this project, which is actually called Improving Prevention and Care of Victims of Forced Marriages, which was implemented in cooperation with La Strada International, and it was actually funded by the French embassy in North Macedonia, and it was solely focused on actually on enhancing the understanding of forced marriages as a form of human trafficking from one side. On the other side, it was also focused on awareness raising and advocacy for efficient prevention and legal measures that could, let's say, address properly this situation that we are encountering. And last but not least, I'm happy that sorry, I will finish right now. I'm happy that last month we also had a big conference. Most of you maybe were on the conference where we have jointly tried to discuss and to clarify a bit more about what is trafficking, what is forced marriages, what are our challenges. And one of the things that I'm happy that we have agreed that we need to harmonize definition, align legal frameworks, fund survivor centers services, and monitor closely the compliance with the European and international community. So basically, this is the last thing that I will say. And I invite you to see our campaign, but also our analysis that is already on our webpage. And I think you already shared it in the chat.
Yeah, I think it was shared in the chat. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. I think some of the things that you were already saying, were also the questions that we would still want to discuss as well. I think one thing which is actually quite important, well, there are so many things to be discussed. It's difficult to streamline also the discussion in a way, because, well, one thing is that you mentioned that predominantly in North Macedonia, it's also the Roma community, but I know from Mariam that she actually says this is not the community that we normally see. And I think this is also important to highlight and stress that we shouldn't be seeing this as, well, in some countries it is, and I mean, this is just a factual situation. But this shouldn't be like seen as the only community that we should look at. So maybe Mariam can also share something about it in a moment. Another thing is that I want to ask all of you the question from Susanna Janse in the chat, whether you actually seen also boys and men among the victims. So please also reflect on that. And maybe, well, yeah, now I'm trying to combine all kinds of questions also due to time. I think one of the things that you actually said that the forced marriages is really used as a way to control people and then to exploit. And this is, I think this is at the heart of where maybe the conceptual problem sometimes starts to appear, because we have this, we say we need a forced marriage criminalization, we need the exploitation of forced marriage in the context of human trafficking. But the moment, how do you really ensure that there is the clarity between the two, and maybe you can reflect a bit. Well, I think Anina already said, well, in Finland, this is not the case. So we see it mostly in the context of trafficking. But this is actually where also a bit of the issues lies. Like, how can you ensure that there is this progressive thinking about, if you have it separately criminalized, that it's not a huge overlap, because with the overlap you might run the risk of not getting justice at all, because it's not well understood how it should be implemented in practice. And of course, this is something that we need to avoid. So maybe I will do it in the 1, 2, 3 is how you are in my screen. So first Mariam, Anina, and then Maria can conclude finally.
Okay, I think that was quite a lot of questions. I'm not,
Yeah, sorry,
I'm not sure
I'm
where to
trying
start.
to.
I will start with possibly who we saw the victims are in Austria. Because I think it's a slightly different group to what Maria has just said. So we analysed the victims who were in the victim protection organisation, okay, over a period of 5 years. That means this is obviously, we can't say that this is all victims, because there will be victims who haven't obviously been in the victim protection organisation, but that is the data that we had. Of the women who had been in the organisation, over 50% over this 5-year period had international protection. Okay, so they had asylum or subsidiary protection. 20% were Austrian citizens. 30% had permanent residency in Austria. So very much a different group, I would say, where we're probably looking, well, we are indeed looking at second and third generation migrants into Austria. What does that mean also in terms of identifying the victims? What we saw in terms of identification, and when we spoke to the victims, because we also spoke to previous victims, is that often forced marriage is being used as a form of punishment. It is being used as a form of punishment for not being Western enough in the way that you live. It is also being used as a form of punishment for LGBTQI persons in Austria. And there we have seen, in order to answer the question that came earlier, male victims. They are not, I have seen these male victims in my migration work, where homosexual men have been forced by their family to marry. But we also heard about it when we were speaking to youth workers that we interviewed here in Vienna for the project. They don't show up in the statistics that we've shown, because the statistics were based on the people who were in the victim protection organisation. But there are male victims, and I think that's very important to say. The male victims themselves said that their situation is slightly different, because through the marriage they often have more freedoms than they have when they're with their family. So that was also quite an interesting aspect. They can quasi continue to a certain extent to live the life that they would want to be almost protected as a result of the marriage. So that was also quite an interesting aspect that came up.
Yeah. Okay, Anina?
Yeah, so first I wanted to say that similar to Mariam, that yes, we've identified male victims of forced marriage in Finland. Often they have this gay background or some other background, but maybe the consequences of these forced marriages are not as serious or full of violence as they are for the women, young and girls. But it's important to acknowledge that. In terms of the background and what type of forced marriages we identify in Finland, there's basically 3 types. They mainly relate to migration context, but I also want to emphasize that technically there could be also forced marriages in our traditional Finnish Christian communities, and we also have a Roma minority in Finland. But mainly the forced marriages concern, so there are couples that have married before they come to Finland. Then there are cases where usually a man already has a Finnish citizenship, and they bring a spouse from their country of origin or their parents' country of origin, and they bring that person to Finland, or a person who has been raised, maybe born, but at least raised in Finland, is then sent by their parents abroad and has been forced to marry. And yeah, so of course, like what is force, what is arranged marriage, what is a situation where if you've grown to, you know, in this kind of culture norm or expectation where you are supposed to marry, do you have like a full freedom to actually even think of saying, no, I don't want to marry, I don't want to do this? So this is like yeah, it's very tricky round. But then if I look at the discussion about forced marriage in Finland, and as I said, it's mainly in this context of human trafficking. And by the way, our trafficking legislation now, it also covers religious unions, because sometimes on paper you can get a divorce, but then you cannot get this religious divorce either, and you're also in a very tricky situation. So I think from the basis of this dilemmas, it's very complicated for the criminal justice system to be like, oh, this is trafficking for forced marriage, and these are like the exact evidence that we can show all these elements of trafficking. But at the same time, I also think that because trafficking is one of the few crimes or offenses where you have this kind of process type of situation that you can take into account like multiple different acts. So it's not just, you know, a single assault and a threat and a rape and so on, but it can cover these kind of aspects of, for example, psychological control. That is like taking control is one of the acts of trafficking in the Finnish context, and according to government proposal, that includes also this kind of aspects of psychological control. So like using a bit the wider perspective, I think it's this using the trafficking route has benefits for the victim, and also benefits for the investigation of cases. As it was pointed out, there are the punishments are harsher, and maybe it's also easier for the law enforcement to put a bit more resources into investigation or to cooperate with other countries, if that would be an aspect. And then I just wanted to point out, which we haven't really that much discussed today, is that people that are fleeing forced marriage, mainly girls and women, can also then, as a result of fleeing forced marriage, to end up in a situation of trafficking, maybe for some other purpose, trafficking for sexual exploitation or labor exploitation and so on. And one more word of advertisement is that I've actually written now an article which is called Forced Marriage in Finland, a continuum from honor-based violence to human trafficking, and it will come out this fall. So it has been accepted into a journal and will come out. So I think I can then later share a link with them if you're interested in that. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Then, Maria, do you still want to add something?
Well, actually, I wanted to reflect on the data that was driven on this analysis, that actually are, according to the census in our country, the prevalence, for example, of child marriages reports that actually 1,355 girls aged 15 to 19 stated that they were married, compared to 260 boys in the same age group that actually also got married. So this is also proof that that boys are affected, but as Nina and Miriam are said, sometimes the consequences that are not so, let's say, evident as in the cases of the girls. So what we also see then in general when it comes to trafficking human beings, there is an increase of the boys and men, but unfortunately there is also a situation they are not really identified as well proactively that reflects on the traditional things that are happening in a way. But anyhow, this I would just stress once again that the core of our analysis, it's not a research, it's analysis of what is already there in the practice already produced, and these are the data that actually gave more, let's say, a broader concept of what is the practical situation in our country comparing what is on the European level. And in reality, we also have a situation that forced marriages at all are not recognized, because there are cases when women, there is an arranged marriage due to economical situation between Macedonian men and Albanian women, for example, which rarely are being, let's say, treated even as a form of prevention of any kind of violence. And in terms of gender equality, we say when it comes to the cases that it's dealt on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for flagging this. Yeah, I do think that it's, I mean, maybe it's sometimes also a bit instrumental in the whole trafficking discussion, but that, yeah, we know that these cases of men and boys are there, but to get them, well, they recognize it themselves, but for them to come forward or be identified, what is the advantage? Most of the time, it's more a taboo. I know that in the Netherlands there had been like also a campaign specifically targeting men, also for because of that reason. But I think there's still a long way to go. Maybe because we are in our final 5 minutes, I just want everyone, including Sophia, to just mention one recommendation that you think should be prioritized now in order to advance the whole discussion about combating forced marriage and the exploitation of forced marriage. So maybe, Sophia, I give you the floor. Which one would you, based on the discussions and the research that you had, what would you...
I think it would be really, really hard to actually just choose one, but I think as our focus was mainly the criminalization of forced marriage, then I think I would say to harmonize what exploitation means for the countries across Europe, to avoid the gaps coming from cross-border situations, to also maybe criminalize it both as a standalone offense and under the trafficking in human beings provision.
Okay, thank you. Mariam?
Yes, I would come from a completely different angle, despite being a lawyer, and say that for me, the most important recommendation would actually be education. Early education regarding self-determination, rights, independence, so that victims can call out for help early. I'm talking about, when they're 9, 10, 11, 12, that they can say, I'm already feeling the pressure. It's not something that I want, so that we can intervene early. And if I may, just because it's very important to me as well, with regards to the religions that were covered, we didn't ask the religion of the victims that were in the protected organization, but I can say that it covers all religions.
Mm-hmm.
It's just important to say.
Thank you. Anina?
Yeah, I want to highlight the importance of raising awareness among professionals that encounter all kinds of different people with different backgrounds who could be victims of forced marriage, or who could be in a situation where they might be then later forced to marry, like people in schools, social workers, child protective services, but also different types of authorities like police and prosecutors and so on. So I think we really need to have more understanding on what is a forced marriage and what it entails. And in the project that we did with Finland, Spain, Ireland, and Germany, we did develop these tools for professionals to use. So I've shared the links in the chat, and I think those are also available in at least 4 different languages. So I think it's important that these people know a bit more about the phenomenon and then can refer people to services that are specialized or can give people information about their rights and, like what is acceptable and forced marriage is a crime and all of that. So I think that's very important as well.
Thank you. Maria, finally.
Yeah, well, more or less everything was covered. I would say that we'll join the others that we definitely need a comprehensive prevention strategy, focused, at least for our case, on eliminating the structural factors that create vulnerability, such as the poverty, the gender inequality, and also discrimination that is quite evident in our case. It also requires promoting access to quality education and strengthening the personal autonomy of the girls more or less, in order to empower them in this aspect. And additionally, I think it's quite essential to reinforce protection system at local, cross-border, as well as international level to prevent, identify, and sanction every form of exploitation through marriage. So basically, that's with what I would finish.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think this, I couldn't have explained it better because you covered actually all the most important recommendations. I do think that we looked at it really at from a legal perspective and the criminal justice response, but we do see based on practice that that's really like a bit of a last resort and will in many cases not be really a viable options, also not in the interest of the victims at times. So I think the most important thing is that irrespective of how we are going to deal with it in the criminal law, that it should be there and should be well well implemented so that it can be used if the interest is there also from the victim. But that the most important thing is that we identify the victims, that they have access to protection and support. And from there, that they have the possibilities to annul the marriage in I find it really quite astonishing to see that sometimes people have to do it within a very limited period of time. And I can only imagine that you are under so much distress that this might be a challenge to begin with. So I think that's also a very important step. And then if there is still the possibility and the evidence, then we can look into the criminal justice response, and then we might have a comprehensive so thank you all. I hope we have answered all the questions. There might be questions, also one about the case and the year. We will come back to it. We will look through the chat and ensure that you will get the answer to the question that was not asked. If there is any question you might still have, you can refer them to La Strada or to me or Sophia. Maybe we can share some of the contact details so that people with follow-up questions can also ask. Then without holding you any further, I like to close this webinar and see you in the near future.